So welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Brian Rowan. I'm a professor of education and a research professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. I'll be hosting this second webinar in a series of 3 webinars on the Measures of Effective Teaching Early Career Grants Program. What I want to do today is give you an overview of the data that will be made available to MET early career grantees. So the presentation today will talk about where you can find descriptions of the data that will be made available, where you can find code books for the data files, and where you can find the instruments that were used in the MET study. I'll then talk about the overall structure of the data files. There will be numerous data files. They'll be linked in various ways, and so I'll be giving you a brief presentation or brief overview of those data files. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about each data file, and I'll spend a considerable amount of time on the teacher observation data file and the student data file, a little less time on other files. And then I'm going to close with some issues that are related to research planning and proposal writing. So as I present my slides, if you have questions, go ahead and enter them, and then we'll have a Q&A period at the end like we did last time. So with that as background, let's go ahead and get started. I want to start with where you can find descriptions of the data. I'm sure many of you already have been searching around for this, but the logical place to begin exploring MET data is the user guide. So the user guide has an overview of the MET study and the study design. It has a description of the sampling and the data collection procedures. And it includes a description of the data files and the variables that are included in the files. Now, you should note that the user guide was recently updated. And if you downloaded it, say, in the past week, you might want to just download it again. The MET data are in a dynamic state of play, and so we find ourselves needing to update the user guide periodically. So you may just want to check back or download the thing every so often as you work along. So the interesting thing, I think, one interesting thing about the user guide is the way the table of contents is organized to give you easy and direct access to information on specific data elements in the study. So you might have already noticed this, but you can use the table of contents to go directly to a section of the user guide that has information that you want. All you need to do is simply click on the section of the table of contents that you are interested in, and you will be taken directly to that section. So if you wanted, for example, information on the framework for teaching observation instrument, you could just simply go and click on section 6.42, and if you did that, you would be taken directly to the pages that have information about the FFT domains and dimensions and scoring. Alternatively, and in fact this is actually the way I prefer to navigate through the user guide, you can download the user guide as a PDF and navigate it with the bookmarks bar in the PDF file. And the good thing about that, of course, is that the bookmarks bar can be slid up and down, and you can navigate the bookmark bar separately from the text, and it's usually the easiest way to navigate through the user guide. Now, the user guide, I'm sure most of you already know this, but if you are new to the webinars and new to this grants competition, you will know that the user guide can be found at the National Academy of Education website. So this is a shot of the homepage of the National Academy of Education. If you look at the new RFP announcement and click here to learn more and apply, that will take you directly to the user guide and other information that you need. Now, as of Tuesday, November 13th, the user guide can also be found at the ICPSR website. At the ICPSR homepage, you would click on Find and Analyze Data, And then when you hit the Find and Analyze Data page, you can go to the Core Partners area down there. This is the screenshot now on the right-hand side. You could go to the area Core Partners and you will find a link there to the MET Longitudinal Database site. This site will go live on the 13th of November. Now, when you click the MET LDB linkage, or when you find it, you will come to the screen shown on the left-hand side of this slide. And there, if you click on Research Grants, you come to the Grantee Program homepage, and you can access the user guide directly. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's a Grantee user guide section and a hot link right to the user guide. The Grantee site will have additional information useful for research planning as well. You can use this page to access codebooks, and ultimately you will be using this page to access the instruments used in the study. Now, this screen shows you an example of a codebook, and it is like all the codebooks for the Grantee data files. This is a shot of the first 2 pages of the teacher file codebook. These codebooks can be quite long because the data files can be quite large, so you'll want to take that into account when you think about downloading and printing and so on. But the codebooks should be up very shortly on the ICPSR grantee website. Soon, although not currently, we will be hopefully getting copies of the instruments that were used in the study. And again, there was a section on the previous slide that I showed you that allows you to click into instruments, and then the instruments are listed, and ultimately we will be having the instruments on that website. Now, just a note on the current state of the ICPSR website. The grantee website, unfortunately, will be under construction even after it goes live. That's because this whole project is in a dynamic process. I'll say a little bit about that in a few minutes, but very soon the website will have the codebooks for all of the grantee data files. That is our highest priority, to get those codebooks posted. The instruments will be posted on the ICPSR website, but ICPSR is still working on getting the permissions from the researchers to post those instruments. So in the meantime, the best advice that I can give you about learning about the data is to work with the code books. We're still working with the MET partners to post the classroom observation instruments, the framework for teaching, the class instrument, the MQI, Plato, QST. We've asked partners, MET partners, to grant us access to the training materials that were used in the study. That will give you a good insider look at these observation protocols. We're still working on that permission, but in the meantime, or if that permission is not granted, you can use the MET project website to learn about the observation protocols. You can use the user guide, and you can use the code books to understand how these observation instruments were used specifically in MET. Those of you who have read the user guide know that the instruments were used in a modified way in the MET study. It's likely that the following instruments will not be posted at the ICPSR website. It may be the case that the content knowledge for teaching assessments could be posted. They may not. My bet would be they probably will not. And certainly the student assessments, the state tests, the SAT-9 open-ended assessment, the balanced assessment for mathematics, and the ACT Quality Core tests as used in the study won't ever be posted. Those are pretty much copyrighted information. But as I said, in the meantime, until all the instruments are posted, consult the user guide, use the code books that are going to be available on the ICPSR grantee website, use the MET website, and you can even conduct searches to gain additional information on a lot of these instruments. So with that as background, where to find information about the data, I'd like to give you now a broad overview of the grantee data files. So first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how ICPSR prepares the grantee files. ICPSR receives the data files directly from RAND. RAND is the organization that is conducting data analyses for the MET study, and some of these analyses are ongoing, and therefore our receipt of data files is ongoing. These data files, once received, are then restructured for grantees. The MET grantee files are assigned a special study number at ICPSR. That study number is 34414, so you can always search the ICPSR website using that study number. The way we've organized the grantee files roughly reflects levels of analysis in possible statistic or measurement analyses, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And as you'll see, the MET data are actually complex. They're quite complex, and depending on the types of analyses you might want to conduct, it's very possible that you'll need to restructure the data files or manipulate data in other ways to get the specific kinds of analyses done that you want to do. That's the nature of complex data and isn't unusual. So let's now take a broad look at the grantee data files and look at the figure to the right, which was included in the user guide, which lists all the grantee data files. So each box in this diagram is a separate data file or group of data files, and there are 7 distinct types of data files. Now, at the very bottom, you see the classroom videos and the video information files. The classroom video files are MP4 files. The video information files are metadata about those MP4 files. We're not going to discuss the video files or the video information files today. We'll have a little bit to say about it at the next webinar. In this webinar, I want to focus on the kinds of files that are above those. I want to talk about the segment level observation score files, what we call the student by section file, the class section file, the teacher file, and the district school file. And if you begin with the student and segment level files, which I'm pointing to right now, and then work your way upwards, as my cursor is indicating, what you'll see is basically that the files are aligned from the lowest levels of data analysis to the highest levels of data analysis. So now I'd like to turn from discussing the general overview of those files to talking more about the specific data files that will be made available to grantees, and I'm going to begin with a discussion of the segment level observation score data files. It's important, I think, for in planning your data analysis for me to give you some overview of these data files, and a logical place to start is at the bottom of the data hierarchy with the segment level observation score files. So let's begin to understand why we have segment level observation data and the role that it plays in the study. So you will recall that in the MET study, each teacher is video recorded on several occasions teaching a single subject. So if the teacher was a generalist teacher, for example, that teacher would be video recorded teaching one class, usually his or her self-contained class. And on 4 days, they would have been recorded as they taught English language arts. And typically on the same 4 days, they would also be recorded teaching mathematics. Now, the specialist teachers have a bit of a different video recording regime. In year 1 of the study, specialist teachers are video recorded teaching 2 class sections of the same subject. And for each class section, they're video recorded on 2 days. In year 2 of the study, however, the specialist teachers are video recorded teaching a single class section, and for that class section, they're video recorded on 4 days. Now, the MET researchers took the videos and scored them with the observation protocols. And the observation protocols typically assigned scores for segments of the video. Those segments would either be 7-minute intervals or 15-minute intervals, and usually they scored about 30 minutes of any given video. So For most of the videos, you'll have at least 2 segments scored. One exception is Framework for Teaching, which scores at the video session level. But the important point to make is that in metadata, the segment level scores are the basic unit of measurement for classroom observation data. So that's why we have the segment level observation data reported at the segment level. But the other important thing to note is that segment data are not independent observations. The segments are nested within observation days. Observation days are nested within classes or class sections, and so on up the hierarchy of data. So let's talk just briefly. I'll give you a visual picture at the bottom of this slide of the nested structure of segment-level observation data for a generalist teacher. So what you'll see if you look at the little diagram here is that each generalist teacher is video recorded teaching a subject, let's say English Language Arts, which is why the box at the top says ELA class. And her teaching is video recorded on 4 separate days, video session 1, video session 2, and so on. And during each video session, the teacher's ELA instruction is normally scored on 2 occasions. Sometimes if it's 7-minute intervals, it'll be more, but if it's 15-minute intervals, there'll be 2 segment scores per video session. So, in the grantee files, or in the language of the local ICPSR language about the MET study, scoring occasions are called segments, and days of recorded instruction are called video sessions. And so what you can see is that each scoring segment is nested within a video session, and video sessions are nested within a generalist teacher's ELA or math class. Now, we can also consider the nested structure of segment-level observation data for specialist teachers. Again, you can refer to the chart at the bottom of the slide where you'll notice that in year 1, and this is year 1 data, each specialist teacher is being observed teaching 2 different class sections, section 1 and section 2. And in each class section, there are 2 days of video recording, video session 1 and video session 2. And then on each day in each section, the teacher's instruction is again normally scored on 2 separate occasions. So again, the scoring occasions are the segments, segment 1 and segment 2. And the video recorded days of instruction are video sessions. And as you can see, each scoring segment is nested within video sessions, and video sessions are nested within class sections, and class sections are nested within teachers, and so on. So what I want to do now is give you an example, an actual example of what a data record would look like when you get the data and start inspecting it. One thing I think I have not yet said, so I will say now, is that the segment-level observation score files are instrument-specific. So there is one segment-level observation score file for every instrument observation protocol used in the study. So I will present this illustration using data from the data records from the Plato segment-level observation score file. So to try to understand how the data look in a data record, let's begin in the yellow area of this slide, and let's look first at the first 3 columns of data labeled segment ID, segment order, and video ID. Now, these are completely fake IDs, but there will be an ID structure like this in the data. And what you'll notice is that each row is an observation segment from a video session. So if you look at the first 2 rows of data, you'll notice that those rows are from a single video session, XXXXX and so on, ASG, SAFD. And notice that this video session has 2 segments, ASG, SAFD 1 and ASG, SAFD 2. And notice that the segment order is a separate variable. And then look at the next 2 rows of data and notice that these rows of data are from a different video and that that video also has 2 segments. Now we can go over to the green section, and you'll notice a set of IDs: district ID, school ID, teacher ID, section ID, and then some variables indicating the grade and subject of the segment. These identify, obviously, the district, school, teacher, section, grade, and subject, and they allow you to link segments to other units, other data elements, other units of analysis. The blue columns are going to allow you to identify who the rater was, which of the many MET people doing the actual scoring of the videos scored a particular video segment. So you will notice that the first two segments were scored by a rater who has an ID of 3. The second two were scored by a rater who has an ID of 1. Each MET rater will have a unique ID. And then you'll also notice this column called primary score. Right here, my cursor is going to indicate that. If that value is 1, it means that the rater was the first person to score it and was the primary rater. I'll show you in a minute what happens with double-scored videos, but these are obviously single-scored videos. The next couple of columns are just notes about the scoring process, and I'll not discuss that. But if you finally then go to the rose-colored columns over here, this is where the actual Plato dimension scores for a segment will begin appearing. And of course, all the dimensions that were scored for any given segment will have a column. And so you can see that the first column is the Plato dimension called intellectual challenge, and that's the score of the teacher for that segment on that dimension. And the second column there, Plato class discussion, that's the score for the teacher on that segment for the dimension called class discussion. So that's sort of what a data record will look like when you dig right down into the data. The next is an example of a data record, again, from Plato, from the Plato file. But this would be how a record looks for a double-scored video. Again, let's go over to the yellow section of the slide and of that table there and look at the first 3 columns of data, which again are segment ID, segment order, and video ID. And then you see I've highlighted the first 4 rows of data, but notice that these 4 rows are from the same video session. And notice that this video has 2 segments and that those 2 segments occur twice. And that's because this video was double scored. So go over to the green column over here on primary rater ID and look to the left at primary score, and you can notice from that this was a double scored video. The rater 1 was the primary scorer and scored the 2 segments, and then a secondary scorer, and that score is denoted as 0 because that person is not the primary scorer, and that's rater 2 also scored the 2 segments of this video. And then, as you can see, you go over and the scores of both raters are recorded. So that's the basic structure that you will encounter in the data files. And now what I want to do is go back to the big picture and try to summarize how the segment level score data are related to the other data files. So, as I said, there are separate segment level files for each observation instrument. You will, when you find the data, find a class segment level observation scores file, an FFT segment level observation scores file, and so on. And as I have indicated, you can link segment level observation data to higher levels of analysis. That's what is meant to be indicated by these upward arrows on the right-hand side of the diagram. So segment data can be linked to class sections, and class sections can be linked to teachers. Now, there's just one little point to be made about the segment level observation scores file. The segment level data will need to be restructured if you intend to nest segments within video sessions. That is, there are no session level observation files. If you're interested in nesting segments within days, you may have to restructure the data to do that. So who would be interested in using segment-level score data? Well, any researcher who's interested in aggregating score data to higher levels of analysis will have to use segment data. Now, MET researchers have already aggregated score data to the section level, but they used harmonic means as their aggregation function. And those aggregation scores are in the grantee section file. But a researcher might want to use a different aggregation function, or a researcher might want to aggregate data to a different level of analysis, or a rater might want to, or an analyst might want to use different scales than the MET researchers use. So anyone who's interested in using a different function or aggregating to a different level, or is not really interested in the scales that were used by the MET researchers, will have to use the segment-level score data. It's also the case that researchers who are conducting basic measurement analyses will want to use the segment-level files. So you are probably aware that MET researchers used segment data when they did their G studies using ANOVA. The basic unit of measurement in those studies is a segment of data. And grantees can use, if you're going to plan on doing your own G study, you can use segment-level data, but grantees will also use segment data in any multi-level or other kind of measurement model that they might be thinking of. Also, it may be the case that researchers want to examine relationships, empirical relationships, among segment-level score data and other variables. For example, a researcher might want to know how segment order affects a score on a given measurement dimension of a particular observation protocol. And that would involve the use of segment-level data. Interestingly, Plato includes a subject matter code for each segment. What subject matter, what area of English language arts was being taught in any given segment. And so you could use segment-level data to explore the effects of content being taught on instructional processes. Now, because segments are not independent observations, a researcher might want to estimate such effects using a mixed model of one sort or another. So those are the basic uses of segment-level score data. Again, segment-level scores are the basic unit of measurement for teaching in the MET study. Now I would like to turn to a discussion of the student data file, which for reasons I think you will see in a minute are called the student by section file in the grantee files. So let's understand why we have a student by section data file. Recall that in the MET study, each student gets included in the data if and only if he or she is in a class section that's being studied. So in the grantee data files, student data are attached to class sections. And for this reason, some students will appear more than once in the data files, the student data files. That's why we call these the student by section data files. So you can imagine that this will be especially true of students of specialist teachers, because these students can appear in the specialist teachers section. They might appear in the class section of another specialist teacher in a different subject, and they might or might not appear in both years of this study. And finally, in any given year, it turns out that students sometimes change classes or class sections. So in a given year, for a given subject, a student might actually appear in more than one section. So I presented this same figure at the last webinar, but I'll just talk about it quickly again, just so you get a feel, a kind of naturalistic feel for how the MET student data work. Imagine that we're studying, we're working inside an elementary school, and we have 2 years of data. And in year 1, we're studying Mrs. J's 4th grade class, and students A, B, and C appear in the class by, or the student by section data. In year 2, we study Mrs. K's 5th grade, and lo and behold, student A appears in that class section as well. However, student B and C are in non-met sections, and so they're out of the study, and these new kids, D and E, come into the study. Another way to think about it, let's use a middle school scenario where we have 1 year of data. Imagine that we're in a school and we have Mrs. J's 8th grade ELA class section that we're studying. And we're also simultaneously studying Mrs. K's 8th grade math class section. And here we have student A appearing in both sections, but B, C, D, and E are only appearing in one of those sections. So you can see the nature of how MET data, how MET student data are handled in the data files. So now let's take a look at an example of a student by section data record so you can understand this. And I'll begin with the most complex case of a middle school student scenario. And again, let's go over now into this yellow section. We'll begin by looking at the yellow section of the record, and you'll notice that there are separate columns that give a student ID, a district ID, a school ID, a teacher ID, a section ID for a year, a grade, and a subject. So if you look now at the first 3 lines of data, you'll notice that the data are for a single student, MET student with the ID equals 1 in year 2 of the study. And that student will maintain that ID across the study. And that student turns out, if you look at right here at lines 2 and 3, this student is actually in 2 English language arts sections during the course of that year. So to understand why that's occurring, you can go over to the rose-colored area of the data record, and you'll see a variable called student added date. So note that the date of entry for this student into the first English language arts section is May 17th, 2010. That date indicates that the student was in this ELA section 2 at the time when year 2 class sections were randomly assigned to teachers. But note as you go down to the next section right here, the 3rd line, that the date of entry for the next section, section 3 of ELA, is 8/20/2010. What that shows is that the student actually never did really enroll in the section to which he was originally constituted, but ended up being in another section. And student mobility will be common in these data, as the user guide discusses in particular in year 2. There were lots of non-compliance and lots of student mobility in the section data. And these student added dates are ways in which you can understand how and why students will appear more than once in the same year in English language arts sections, for example. So the next set of columns I want to discuss are these columns in green, and they are columns that chart the randomization process at the section level. So you will notice, for example, if you look at this, that each of the sections being studied here were randomized. That's the column randomized equals 1. That means the principal constituted roughly equivalent class sections, and then the MET researchers randomly assigned those sections to teachers. But you'll notice when you go randomized in assigned section that the student on line 3 receives a 0, meaning that that student was not in his original randomized section. At any rate, these data are quite complex, but again, they are student by section records. Let's look now to another example. This would be an elementary school student with a generalist teacher. So again, we'll start over here in the yellow area and look at the first 2 lines of data, and notice that for year 2 of this study, we actually have 2 different students, student 10 and student 11. And notice that these students are in a grade 5 generalist classroom. Now, you can go over to the green sections right here and notice the randomization data. Notice the columns of data, the teacher's class, this is one class with 2 students. That class was randomly assigned to the teacher. The teacher's ID is there, and both of these students have not moved. They're in their original assigned classroom as of 5/17/2010. So that means that the students were assigned to this class over the summer and they didn't move out of it. So that's the basic structure of the student by section data record. But there are additional data columns in these records, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these. But a point I want to begin with is that each time a student appears in a student by section record, relevant data on that student also appear. So the student by section data records include not only the IDs I just showed you, but also the following other information. There is demographic information on students: the age of the student, the sex of the student, whether or not the student was enrolled in a gifted and talented program, whether or not the student was in special education, but not the special education classification of the student's free lunch status, the student's ethnicity. And these data appear in every student by section record. So if a student is in 2 or 3 sections in a given year, that student's demographic information appears in every record. Also, state test scores in English language arts and math, which are reported as rank-based Z-scores, will be reported for 2008 to the year of the record in every student by section record. On the other hand, scores for any of the alternative assessments that were administered for a year of data record will appear in the student by section record only when the student was in that section at the time of testing. And the same is true of item level student perception survey data. That will appear in a student by section record only for the section a student was enrolled in at the time of survey administration. So to summarize, student level demographic data and student level test data are included in every student by section record. And so you will have the same data on a student recorded in multiple lines. But if the student was in a section for only part of the year, then alternative assessment data, the SAT-9 open-ended or the BAM or the ACT end of course assessments, or the student survey data will appear only in the section where the student was tested or surveyed. And because you have all the dates and all the various information, you can weight any student by section record by the amount of time that a student spent in that section if you want to do that, although this will require you to do some data manipulation. At any rate, these student records are quite complex, so let's look at the relationship of student data to other data. As I think I said last time at the webinar, the MET study is a longitudinal study of teachers, not students, and that's why the student data look like this. And because of the way the MET study was conducted, a student appears in the data only when he or she is enrolled in a MET class. So we're not studying students over time, we're studying teachers over time, and students come into the data only if they're in a MET class section. And again, some students are going to appear in the student by section data file more than once if they're enrolled in more than one MET section in a given year or across years. And student by section data can be linked to teacher data, section data, school data, and so on by the MET ID system. So a question is, who would want to use the student data? Well, any researcher who wants to recalculate the MET value-added scores for sections, or if you want to actually aggregate them up to the teacher level, you will have to use student by section data. So in webinar 1, I described the value-added model that was estimated by MET researchers. And those VAM scores are in the section file that will be made available to you. So you have the value-added scores for teachers at the section level as they were calculated by MET researchers. But if you don't like that value-added model and want to calculate your own, then you'll have to use the student by section file to do that. In addition, researchers who want to aggregate student data to the section level will have to use the student by section data. Now again, note that MET researchers already aggregated many variables and scales to the section level, and those aggregated data as completed by the MET researchers appear in the section file that will be made available to you. But, if you don't like the way they aggregated the data or have another interest in something else you want to aggregate, then the student by section data file is the one you'll use. Researchers conducting measurement analyses of the student surveys, the student perception survey, the tripod survey, might want to use the student by section file because that's where the item responses are, and that's how you would create a measurement model. Also, researchers might want to excuse me a minute, might want to examine relationships among student outcomes and other variables. So you might want to examine how student perceptions are related to social background. And because student observations are not independent, you might want to estimate these kind of effects using a mixed model that takes into account the nesting of students within sections, or you might want to estimate section-level effects. Again, that could entail using a mixed model. But at any rate, the student by section data can be quite complex, and you'll have to do some restructuring depending upon your analysis. But this is the most logical way for us to organize these data given the purposes of the MET study. So now I'd briefly like to go on to some other files. I'm going to talk about these in much less detail than I did the previous two files because they turn out to be much less complex. So let's begin with the class section file. Now, the class section file includes an identifier for each section that was included in the MET study. So there'll be a section ID, a subject ID, a grade level, a year, and that will be for each class section that was in the study in year 1 or year 2. So any class section that was in the MET study is in the class section file. And each section can be associated with a teacher ID, a school ID, a district ID. The class section file, in addition to these IDs, also contains aggregated data from the observation scores files and the student by section data file. The data elements that have been aggregated include student demographics, test score data, student survey data, observation score data, and VAM scores. This was all done by MET researchers, and the section level file contains all of those aggregated measures. And the section data can be nested within teachers. Now, the MET researchers did not do a lot of that kind of analytic work, but it is possible to analyze teaching quality across a teacher's sections. It's an interesting issue, and it might involve the use of a variety of mixed models where sections are nested within teachers. The most obvious case would be specialist teachers, so any given specialist teacher in year 1 has 2 sections of data, so you might think of sections as being nested within teachers. Or you might think of sections, combining sections across years. For example, a specialist teacher who participated in both years of data collection would have 3 sections of data, and a generalist teacher would have 2, and those could be nested within teachers. And a very interesting problem, and one that I've not seen anyone address yet using MET data, is how to analyze data for generalist teachers, because these teachers have only 1 section record per year, but the record includes separate data on English language arts and math teaching. So it's an interesting question how these data can be analyzed jointly. And one could imagine that there are a lot of different statistical models that one might use to analyze such data, depending on your analytic assumptions or your theoretical perspective. But that's a brief overview of the class section file. Now let's go up to the teacher file. want to say just a few words about the teacher file. The teacher file contains one record for each teacher who participated in the study, and there's one record there regardless of the number of years that the teacher participated. Each teacher has a unique Met ID, and variables in the teacher file denote each teacher's study status by year. The teacher file will include such basic data like things like teaching experience, the sex of the teacher, the ethnicity of the teacher. The teacher level file is where you will go to find item level responses to the teacher working conditions survey for teachers who participated in year one and completed that survey. You will also find in the teacher file the item responses to the MET teacher survey that was conducted in year two. You'll find the item responses for teachers who were in the study in year two and completed that survey. The teacher file is where you will find the CKT assessment scores for teachers who participated in year two of the study and completed the assessment. The teacher file also includes the principal's ratings of a teacher's effectiveness. So you won't find those principal ratings in the principal file, which I'll talk about in a minute, but you'll find that down at the teacher's level. Each teacher has the principal's rating of that teacher, and that will be for teachers who participated in year two. Just a brief note, if you're planning or if you're thinking about aggregating teacher data to the school level, to come up with like a measure of school climate or something, you should be aware that the MET teacher sample is not a representative sample of teachers in a school. So when you aggregate responses from the MET teachers only, your aggregated score might be biased because of the sample. So let's go to the final file that I want to discuss now. This is the school district file or the district school file. I confuse which comes first, but it is the case that MET researchers didn't much study issues of school context and how that's related to teaching quality. And so there's very limited data about schools or districts in the district school district data file. The data file contains one record for each school that participated in the study, regardless of the number of years that the school participated. I recall from the user guide that some schools did drop out. But each school and district has a unique ID, and data on school study status by year is included in the school district file. The school is the actual record in the school district file. Item level data from the Y2, the year 2 principal survey, are included in the school file. So if you're looking for the principal survey, it's in the school file. And there's just some very basic demographic information that has been aggregated up from the student by section files to the school level. But again, as I have said, I think on several occasions during this webinar, the student samples, like the teacher samples, are convenience samples, and they're not representative samples of students. So, you might want to treat those aggregations with some care. So that concludes my discussion of the data files themselves. I just want to say a few words and provide just a little bit of advice about research planning, proposal preparation and research planning. So if you have looked at the RFP, you know that one of the criteria that will be judged, that proposals will be judged by, is significance. So what kind of questions will reviewers be asking when they think about significance? Well, one question they will have is, does the proposal make a compelling case that the project is moving beyond current MET research and findings? So if you're interested in enhancing the significance of your proposal, it's very important for you to read the research that's posted at the MET project website and to think about ways to extend this research. Now, one way would be to just analyze the questions that MET researchers already addressed in a slightly different way, in a way that might change the interpretation or modify it or deepen it. But another way is to pose new research questions with the data. At any rate, the reviewers will be thinking about the relationship between your study and research that is already posted at the metproject.org website. Another important criteria will be whether or not the work that's being proposed seems to be promising for advancing knowledge and understanding in the domains of research on teaching or teacher policy. So, I think you need to try to connect your proposed study to pressing questions in research on teaching or to current events in teaching policy. The MET study is a study of effective teaching, and it's a lot about research on teaching and teacher policy. And so I think that reviewers will be looking for the connection between your proposed study and studies of teaching quality. Now, the RFP suggests some possible types of research that can meet the goals that I just talked about, but again, this is an investigator-initiated competition, and just because we think it's interesting doesn't mean it's the only interesting thing, and you are free to propose research that you find interesting as long as you can justify its epistemic significance to the education research community. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the section of the reviewing criteria that are called the research plan. So reviewers will be judging the quality of your research plan, and here's some advice about how to improve it. First of all, I think it's very important that you learn as much as you can about the MET data, and that when you describe the data that you are going to use, that you are as specific as possible when you describe the data that you're going to use in your study. So don't propose to, quote, use the student survey data or the teacher working conditions survey. Actually name the variables and connect those variables to scientific constructs. And you can do this by consulting the code books and the instruments and by identifying the variables that you use and then connecting those to scientific constructs and prior research. Further, you should be as specific as possible about the sample that you're going to use in your data analysis. Don't propose to just use data on students. Specify the year, the grades, the academic subject areas that you're actually proposing to study. Also, you should be sure that the statistical or measurement models that you are proposing are appropriate to the data that you want to analyze. So you really need to know the structure of your data, how you're going to structure the data, what that will look like. And while the MET data are complex, it's not the case that the most complex statistical model will win the day. In fact, I think reviewers will prefer statistical models that are simpler rather than more complex, as long as they're appropriate to the data. As you describe the statistical models that you're going to use, to the extent possible, avoid saying things like, I'll use structural equation modeling, or I'll use HLM, or I'll use IRT modeling to analyze the data. You can actually write the equations or describe them, and when you do, it becomes much more apparent to the reader what it is that you are going to do exactly. And often, when you're planning your own research, it becomes much more apparent to you what you're going to do if you can actually write the equations down or describe them in your mind or on paper. Now, you do not have access to the data prior to writing your grants proposal. That's just an unfortunate circumstance of the wishes of the sponsors and the data use agreements in play. And because of that, formal power analyses are not going to be required for this competition. But it is the case that you probably should give reviewers a sense of your sample size and your judgment about its adequacy for your analyses. And, everybody recognizes that these are going to have to be guesstimates about sample sizes and variance components and so on. So, justify your assumptions by reference to the code book or the user guide. I've said this a number of times, I'll say it again. You should remember that MET student and teacher samples and MET schools and districts are not representative. They're a convenience sample, and you should understand how that affects your work. And finally, you should probably consider how you're addressing problems of causal inference if you're in a causal inference mode of reasoning. So with that, that brings me to a conclusion for my formal presentation. Oh, no, it doesn't. I'm sorry. I'm going to also talk a little bit about personnel and resources. So, you know, we've just gone through a very complex set of data, and therefore I think it's important for me to give you the following advice. As you think about this grants competition, which is for 1 year's worth of work and $25,000, choose a feasible project that you can do within the time frame and the cost. I think you probably should avoid extraordinarily complex data analyses, and you probably shouldn't attempt grand theory. It's perfectly reasonable for this grants competition to propose an exploratory project that has limited samples or data elements, especially if you're at the cutting edge of research and theory. So, again, people will judge the feasibility of your project by just how complex it is. The other thing that people look at when they think about feasibility, and it shows up in the personnel and resources scoring, is your expertise to accomplish the project. So it would be very important in the personnel section to describe any relevant training that you have relevant to the analyses that you are proposing in your relevant publications. And if you're proposing to work with a team, then it's probably worth describing the mix of expertise or citing the relevant training and accomplishments of the various team members. And finally, reviewers are going to wonder if you require resources beyond those in your budget, and if so, what they are. And they'll also wonder if you have adequate time to do the project, so I'm sure you'll want to address those questions in your proposal. So that, now I do think, brings me to the Q&A period. So what I'm going to do is open up the questions, and if I can get this to where I can read it better. Well, I guess not. So let's see what kinds of questions we have. We've got about 25 minutes, and I'm just going to take them in order. So here's a question that says, hi, if we fail in getting the grant this year, is there an opportunity to revise and resubmit next year? Well, this is a one-time only grants competition, so the answer to that is no. On the other hand, depending upon the number and quality of proposals that we get, we may engage in a round of revisions, we may not. So, but there is only 1 year for this competition. And then the data are open to all qualified researchers, and you can go and search for sources of funding through the usual channels. Here's a question that says, you mentioned that the MET data will be open to the public in 2014 if the grantees are interested in follow-up studies. Will they get open access post-grant period? Well, yes, under the same conditions that everybody else does, which will not be onerous. So the answer would be yes, you can keep working on this as long as you can get the access in the ways that everybody else does. This one says, does one have to use the sample budget form provided by NAED? Can one use the standard budget form from the institution? I get where that's coming from, but I would prefer, and I think the reviewers would prefer, the NAED budget form. All you got to do is transfer the appropriate lines from your institution's budget form to the one that NAED has. And if you wish to send the institutional budget form as support documents, I suppose that's okay too. It says, where can I find papers using ICPSR data? I'm not sure if that's ICPSR data in general or the MET data in particular. If you're interested in how MET data has been used by MET researchers, go to the metproject.org website. If you're interested in ICPSR in general, go to the ICPSR website. But no one besides the original MET partners have analyzed MET data competition is the first opportunity for researchers outside the original MET project to analyze these data. And I think that's a really interesting and important opportunity. And you will have a great first mover advantage. Here's a question that says, can we get access to some demographic characteristics of the teachers, like gender by grade level, before submitting our proposal? Well, we probably can't give you that kind of access. We'd have to make a special run, but you will notice, and you can notice from general data, that is provided by the Department of Education. So the teacher code book will show you the gender of the teachers. They are largely female. I can't remember the percentages exactly. And, you could make some distributions about, some assumptions about the distributions across grade levels by looking at other kinds of data sets and things. Can we get information regarding the type of knowledge, content, and pedagogical content? I guess this is a question about, what kind of knowledge was the teacher pedagogical content knowledge assessment intended to capture? There are documents on the MET website that describe the intentions and the domains of the teacher content knowledge assessments. I won't go beyond that. There are also publications by people about this issue, and so you can look there too. Do the two segments of the video session capture the entire portion of the class that was video recorded? The answer is no. The videos are often longer than, and the class session was actually longer than the scored portion of the class session. They scored the first 30 minutes. That's the decision they made, probably because they were scoring thousands of observations. I don't know what the actual elapsed time of a lesson is, but I think, as the user guide says, the average length of a scoring session was 30 minutes. Again, I don't know what the average actual elapsed time of instruction was. Is it the case that all sections in the data set have a unique ID? That is, yes. General, what proportions of students in a given section are actually observed in the sample? I guess that's a question of, I could think about that question in a number of different ways. One is, are there students for whom permission was not granted, and therefore they're in that section but are missing? And I'm afraid to say I don't know the answer to that question, but if you send Judy on a note that asks that question, I'll have one of my analysts try to figure that one out. Otherwise, anybody who gave permission, and if I recall, most of the districts were using passive consent, so most of the most sections should have almost all students because of the passive consent. So that, I guess, would be my answer to that. Were the Z-scores of students' data assessments computed based on the means and standard deviations at the state level? That's a good question. I'm thinking that the Z-scores were computed at the district level. So each of those Z-scores is on a district distribution, but again, read that user guide, because it may well be that in fact those Z-scores were computed for some, if not all, of the assessments on the MET sample within the district. So that issue is actually discussed in the MET user guide, and I'm sorry I can't exactly remember the answer to the question, but it's a good question and an important question, and thanks for asking it. It's in the user guide. That is discussed. If you aren't getting a satisfactory answer from the user guide, ask that question of Judy on, and she'll forward it on. In the class section files are each of the 7 subscale scores for tripod available as separate variables? Yes, and then some. I mean, the MET researchers did a variety of, used a variety of subscales and combined the items in various ways. So the answer to that is yes, and you'll see that when the section level codebook is released. In the teacher files of principals' ratings of teacher performance, were the ratings for teachers in any MET teacher in year 1 or only in year 2? The answer is that these ratings apply only to year 2 teachers, since that rating, the principal survey on which it was based, and the subsequent ratings were done only in year 2, so that's only for year 2 data. Yes, this is a question, are mixed methods of analysis acceptable for the grant proposal? Well, absolutely, although as you will see in the next webinar, the sample of videos is somewhat limited by a problem of data use agreements and consents, but mixed methods of analysis which try to look at videos and get behind the scores or any other form of mixed method that you're thinking about are definitely encouraged and would be extremely interesting. Is it possible to link school-level data from the Common Core of data to the schools in the MET data? I am thinking that while that's a pretty good idea, it may not be allowed by the data use agreements. So would you please forward that question to Judy on, and I'll get a definitive answer for you on that one. I don't know how many questions we have left. Then it's 3:15, but I'm just going to keep going until 3:30. Do you anticipate the survey instruments will be available before the grant before the grant deadline submission? Well, yeah, I do. The survey instruments, I think, are not going to be terribly problematic, but the interesting thing about the surveys is that the code books will tell you what the items were on the surveys, and so, you know, that shouldn't be a problem. Can I hire, this is a budget question, can I hire a graduate student at a different institute as a research assistant? I see no reason why not. Is it possible to view video to rate on something not captured in the MET study? I presume that that means, can you create your own scoring rubric and then use it, apply it to MET video? Yes, that is in fact encouraged. Again, you'll have to get some better understanding of the actual video sample available, but yeah, that's one of the things that I think is a good potential use of MET data. This question is, are there existing transcripts for the classroom videos? The answer is no. There are no transcribes. The classroom discussion and stuff is not transcribed. You'll, if you're interested in transcription, you'd have to do it yourself. Is it appropriate to include a consultant in your budget? Yeah, sure. I mean, if you think so and need that, no, I have no problem with that. Will there be item-level data available for the content knowledge for teaching measures? You know, please send that question to Judy on, or wait for the code book to come out. I just can't answer that one off the top of my head. You know, one would hope so, but I am not sure that that will be the case. Is it okay to propose a shorter timeline? Yeah, I mean, you know, if you think that's feasible, go ahead. Just don't propose a longer timeline. Is it possible to collect additional data from participating teachers? The answer to that is no. There is no possible way that you can go from the MET IDs in the grantee data files to real teachers. And in fact, any identification of a real person from the MET data would violate the data use agreement. Is the content knowledge for teaching measure used to assess mathematics teachers in the MET study the same as the mathematics knowledge for teaching instrument? I don't think it's exactly the same. In fact, I would venture a guess that it's not certainly exactly the same. Whether it has item overlaps, I couldn't tell you. On page 43, the user guide mentions raters' best guess at teachers' mathematical content knowledge based on the lesson. Could you explain what this measure is? That's at the end of the scoring on the MQI instrument, the rater is asked to make a estimate of the teacher's content knowledge for teaching. It is what it is. It's the rater's estimate of the teacher's content knowledge for teaching. And you know, in MQI, of course, there's a kind of emphasis on the correct use of mathematics in the lesson, so one presumes that it's information like that these raters are using after having thought about it and observed the mathematics, the way the teacher handles the mathematics during instruction, that is the basis for their estimate of the teacher's knowledge. Teams are allowed to apply. That was a question about, can teams apply? Yes, teams can apply as long as the teams are all early career people. Here's a question about video. And, you know, I think that we will be talking about video more next week. And right now, I'm not on top of the actual numbers, but I will just say that all of the videos that were captured are not necessarily available for viewing because of data use agreements. And so we'll talk a little bit next week about what the prospects are and what is available now and so on for those of you interested in using video in your analyses. Again, I think that the answer to whether or not you can use video depends upon how many videos your study actually needs and in what subjects. So I do think it's feasible to analyze video data. It just depends upon, you know, sample size and things like that. So, you know, here's a question that says, I'm over here talking about personnel and the proposal doesn't mention anything about personnel, but any good proposal would certainly mention personnel. And Dake, if you wish to ask that question to Judy on, it will be forwarded to me and I'll show you where in the proposal you should talk about yourself. So this is a question that says, you said student assessments will not be posted, so the grantees will not be able to see assessment items at any time, but grantees will have access to student scores on these measures. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And in fact, if you're interested in knowing something about the balanced assessment of mathematics, if you fish around the internet, you can actually see the kinds of items. But again, the actual items that are used are not going to be available. Yeah, you can use, this is, can the grant be used to buy out courses? Well, you know, you can use the grant any way you want. If you need to buy your time, buy your time. Should the personnel section be in the 7, this is Dake again, you know, why don't you send a note to Judy about this, Dake, and we'll clear up where your discussion of yourself will go. Will this webinar be available after the meeting for review of the data structures? Yes. Linda talked about that at the beginning. You go to the ICPSR YouTube site, and that's where it'll be available. Here's a question that says, are there documents that outline more technical aspects of the models and analyses in the in the MET reports. So unfortunately, the MET reports are generally not very technical. And I'm not sure whether this question is, are there documents that describe what G-theory is and how to do it, or are there extreme technical documents for how the G study was done in the MET data in particular? If the question is the former, obviously there are lots of documents. If the question is the latter, then you'll have to use the MET documents on the value-added model. That's the actual value-added model that was used is described in our user guide, and I think is described in MET documents as well. So here's a question about, says, I need to use teacher-level dimension scores of the Plato. After averaging scores to the teacher level, these scores will become continuous instead of categorical. Well, so if you thought that these scores were not continuous in the first place, I wouldn't recommend averaging them. This is one of these questions about creating a model that fits the data, or at least your assumptions about the data. It's true that the MET researchers conceived of the scores on something like Plato or Framework for Teaching as if they were continuous variables, and they averaged them. You need not do that. There are measurement models that don't assume that these are continuous variables. So the answer to that question actually depends on the assumptions that you want to make and the measurement model that you want to apply given your assumptions about the data. So I know I didn't address that directly. It says, are the 4 sections per teacher randomly chosen? The answer to that is no. They were not randomly chosen. Nothing about those sections is random. They're more or less a negotiation process or a convenience sample. So I'll leave it at that. This question is, do you happen to know the demographic breakdown of student participants by race and ethnicity? I think some of that's covered in the user guide. If it's not, it'll be in the student by section file, more or less. I mean, it is more minority than the average school district in the United States, but I think I'm pretty sure the user guide has some data about that. In the segment level observation scores file for any instrument, will the scores provided be the actual item scores, or will they be constructs based on the item scores, or perhaps both? The answer is that at the segment level, they are the actual scores recorded on each item. And then at levels higher than that, once the MET researchers begin to aggregate data, they aggregate data into scale scores of various sorts. So that's the answer. But at the segment level, what you have are the actual scores. Here's a question that asks, does anybody ever aggregate the segment or section levels to the teacher level? And the answer is that the MET researchers do not do this. And one might ask whether it's actually legitimate to do this, because it isn't all of the sections that a teacher taught, or a representative sample of potential segments that a teacher could have taught. On the other hand, you may wish to do that. It's an interesting question. The MET researchers generally worked at the section level. It says, what will grant winners, when will they be announced, and what is the timelines that grantees have to work with? The announcement should be sometime in January, and I believe that that's discussed in the RFP. Are the item level data for the subscales, are there item level data? Yeah, there are item level data for the surveys. Again, this is another question that says, could you say whether or not anything ever gets aggregated up to the teacher level, the observation scores? The observation scores, as I said, the MET researchers did not aggregate to the teacher level. There are no transcripts. Says, is there a way to link video codes to the actual segments of video? Well, yeah, I mean, you just follow the time. You know, so the video's running and you know what segment you're in, and so, you know, you have the data that says it's segment 1 or segment 2, so that allows you to know when and you know the length of a segment, so yeah, you can associate the quantitative scores to a particular area of a video. Says, does each student have a pre- and post-test score for the student assessment? Well, you know, it's like anything else, there's missing data. And, you know, so the answer to that is no, there are missing data. So there's another one on the demographic breakdown. When will videos from year 2 be available? We'll talk about that again next time. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to keep going. This is, can I hire a grad? I might be recycling through this. So there was another question about the criteria for selecting videotaped sections. Again, that is convenience. Here's a question that says, are they only aggregated the observation scores by harmonic means by instrument and not subdimensions of instrument? It says, so in the class section file, the observation instrument scores are only aggregated by harmonic means by instrument and not subdimensions of instrument. No, they're aggregated by harmonic means of subdimensions and so on. Again, that will be shown in the when you get the code books. This one says, if MET researchers work mostly at the section level, does that in most cases translate to teacher level for generalists in elementary? Yeah, it does. Although, remember that you have the same teacher teaching English language arts and mathematics, and to my knowledge, the MET researchers have not yet combined indicators of teaching effectiveness for the same teacher across multiple subjects in grades 4 and 5. And that does appear to be, well, I got this one question. Should the PI submit the application, or can an editor from the affiliated institution do that? I'm not sure I know how to answer that, but generally the principal investigator submits his or her proposal through his or her institution. So one would want to have the proposal submitted. That is, the letter of the letter that one submits, or any grant proposal, is actually submitted from an institution, not a principal investigator, but any institutional submission needs a principal investigator. So I hope that explains things. At any rate, that does bring our webinar to a conclusion, and I'd like to thank you for hanging in there with me, for those of you who have hung on. Again, if you have specific questions, you can email them to Judy on, and Judy will forward them to a cognizant party, and we'll try to get answers to any questions that we haven't addressed so far. So thank you, and Linda, I'm going to turn it back to you.